Hello, and welcome back to the Aced It podcast. This is season 9, of course, where we turn science into sense. In this season, we provide 10 timely episodes with the hopes of helping listeners understand what we can learn from current research on harm reduction. And let me just say, there is so much here to learn. So, I'm glad you're with us. I'm Danielle Rudes, your host, and this is Aced It. There is this thing called precarious work, and that's what I want to talk about today. Precarious work is becoming even more common with employers in today's economy. Precarious work is work that has non-standard work assignments, job insecurity, low wages, and a lack of social benefits. By non-standard work arrangements, this means the work is informal, temporary, and lacks formal employment contracts, which then leads to low control over wages, hours, working conditions, and future work for the employee. This type of work is usually done by individuals who are in socioeconomically marginalized groups. Precarious work can have extra impacts on workers too, with it leading to things like worker anxiety, life plan disruptions, and powerlessness. People who use drugs around the world have lower employment rates than any other social group. This low employment rate and discrimination can force individuals to turn to peer engagement jobs. Peer engagement, or peer work, is a labor context where people who use drugs are engaged specifically because of their lived or living experience of substance use. It was promoted by harm reduction and drug user movements to encourage the opinions of people who use drugs in the decisions that affect them. The one negative of this, though, is that it doesn't guarantee paid work. Peer workers can be unpaid volunteers, contractors, or even paid through incentives like gift cards instead of a traditional salary or work contract. They also do not have the emotional, financial, or operational support, which leads to a high level of pressure, burden, and trauma. With the overdose crisis in North America, and frankly all around the world, peer work has gained popularity in mainstream health and harm reduction organizations. With this popularity, though, not many studies have examined peer work conditions, and none have done so using a precarious work framework. Alyssa Greer from the School of Criminology at Simon Fraser University in Canada and her colleagues take on this challenge in their study by doing an in-depth critical examination of the conditions of peer work in British Columbia. They look more closely at the precarious characteristics of peer work and how the workers experience them, both in the context of their life circumstances and labor inequities. For this study, Greer and her colleagues did qualitative interviews in 2017 and 2018 with 15 people who used drugs who had recently engaged in peer work. Qualitative interviews just mean that their data was in the form of words instead of numbers. Important to this study is how the researchers defined peer work. They defined it as paid, as well as unpaid activities related to health and harm reduction services. In their interviews, the researchers asked several questions that prompted descriptions of peer work conditions, experiences, and differences from other workers. They also paid attention to what was left unsaid during the interview, like nonverbal communication, context, and ideas that were related to the topic they were looking at. You may be wondering, what do you do with these interviews and data that's made up of words? The researchers here did what is known as a thematic analysis, which is where they look for themes in the words of the interviews after they're finished collecting the data. Now, on to the good stuff, the findings. First, focusing on the demographics of the sample, Greer and her colleagues most of them were middle-aged and white. The majority of them had stable housing, and all of them were impacted by poverty. Interestingly, none of the participants engaged in employment outside of peer work. When it came to peer work, the norm was non-standard arrangements or ones that were casual and informal. Only 4 of the participants had either full or part-time formal employment. They all would also engage in volunteer work for a stipend and those types of jobs every so often, which is those jobs that are short and single task for small cash wages. We now know all about the sample, but what did the participants say about precarious conditions and peer work? That's what we want to know for this episode. The researchers saw 4 themes that were interrelated, all defined using the words of the participants. This included sporadic and random, a disposable labor force, poverty pimping, and there's no rights. For sporadic and random, the participants were concerned with the uncertainty of the arrangements surrounding peer work. They were dissatisfied with the sporadic nature because the instability that came with the unpredictable work hours, wages, and locations. This is especially true because they experience poverty and need to earn income. The inconsistency of the work had several consequences for participants, making it difficult for them to make long-term plans or have financial or social stability. This includes housing insecurity, interpersonal conflicts, and debt. On the other hand, though, some of them liked these arrangements because they were low barrier and flexible. The second theme, a disposable labor force, was about participants having a deep sense of insecurity about their work. Participants' insecurity was linked to their fear of losing work and the lack of control they had over work arrangements. It is also about the power imbalances they faced with employers. The employers could be non-committal and controlled their job futures. Peer workers had to continuously prove their value to their employers. They knew that they were easily replaceable. Just as the previous problem, this also was made worse by the financial insecurity participants had, and some employers could use this to control the workers and their work conditions. The participants felt powerless in these structural circumstances, and the lack of choice they had, along with their instability financially, pushed them to accept work precarity. The third theme, poverty pimping, is related to the pay that peer workers receive. The pay standards for them were low and variable. In British Columbia, the provincial minimum wage is $12.65 Canadian dollars per hour, but peer worker wages were often below this. When they were paid for work, some were even paid as low as $3 an hour. As mentioned, the wages were variable, and they ranged from this low of $3 to $30 per hour. The participants wanted higher and more consistent pay. They also talked about how their pay inequity existed between them and non-peer workers. Lastly, participants talked about how there's no rights. Peer workers didn't have access to workers' rights, and they weren't aware of what was included in their rights. As I mentioned before, there were no formal contracts between the employee and the employer for these jobs, so they were systematically restricted in terms of their access to rights. Peer workers talked about the violations to their rights that included the wages below provincial minimum wage, the lack of social benefits, physical and verbal intimidation, and no access to safety standards. Collective action to help improve these conditions was important to peer workers. Some even suggested creating a union for them to promote their rights. Greer and her colleagues saw clear evidence of precarious work conditions in peer work. These precarious conditions weren't limited to one type of organization either. They were seen in both big and small ones. The researchers' work here brings important knowledge to precarious work, as the studies have been done before on other marginalized groups like those who are disabled, youth, women, and immigrants and refugees. Greer finds the fact that peer work is precarious to be concerning because these conditions have negative health outcomes and are damaging to both mental and physical health. Before you bring the precarious work conditions into it, peer workers are already facing stress because of high work demands and the opioid crisis without support. All right, we know what precarious work conditions are, that the peer workers face them, and the negative impacts they have on workers. So what do we do about it? Greer and her colleagues have a few ideas to start improving peer workers' conditions. They first caution away from normalizing these informal work arrangements in harm reduction, considering the inequalities in pay and work. Greer highlights the need to sensitize employers to a range of worker preferences, as well as to offer a variety of work means and options, like standard, part-time, and full-time, and informal too. In addition to this, peer workers want to have control over how the work is done and the access they have to it. This can be difficult for individual peer workers to accomplish, though, because individualized acts of resistance exposes them to discipline from their employer. If they go to work together in a collective movement or a union, though, there is support, and it politicizes precarious work. Taking all this into account, Greer suggests locally unionizing peer work. Doing this can establish the workforce of peer workers as legitimate, valued, and deserving of rights, benefits, and equity. There it is. Peer work for people who use drugs is precarious work. There are challenges in their work conditions with instability in schedules and pay, a lack of rights, and a sense of insecurity. They work in harm reduction, and they are being harmed. Harm reduction employers need to remember these things and ensure peer workers in the future have improved experiences so that they are not harmed as they work so hard to help. Thank you for listening to the Aced It podcast. We love hearing from you. So if you have comments, topics to suggest, or some science you'd like us to cover in a future season, please write to me, Danielle Rudes at Sam Houston State University. My email is drudes@shsu.edu. And of course, thank you to the Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network, or JCOIN's Coordination and Translation Center, funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, housed at George Mason University, where this podcast originated. Thank you to our fabulous scriptwriters, Dr. Alyssa Toman from Texas State University and Sam Houston State University doctoral student Caitlin Bauer. And a huge and heartfelt thank you to Jason Luchin and the team at Slonky LLC for their spectacular production. Tune in again soon for another episode of Aced It.